On a shelf in a farmhouse kitchen in Iowa, there is a ledger with two kinds of handwriting in it. One hand is small, quick, and even, the hand of someone who has been adding columns of figures since she was 7 years old. The other is slow and careful, the letters a little uneven, as though each one had been worked for, practiced, earned. The first hand had been writing in that ledger for years before the second one ever appeared in it. This is the story of how the second hand came to be there at all. In the autumn of 1874, in a narrow brick building on Randolph Street in Chicago, a woman named Clara Whitfield sat at a high wooden desk with a ledger open in front of her. A different ledger then, one that belonged to her employer and not to her. She was 28 years old. It was early evening, and the gas lights outside had just been lit, throwing long yellow stripes across the floor through the window blinds. The office smelled of ink and coal smoke. Clara had been adding the same column of figures for the third time, not because she had made an error, but because the office was warm, and the street outside was not, and she was in no hurry to leave it. She wore a gray wool dress with the sleeves pushed back to the elbow, ink staining the side of her right hand the way it always did by the end of the day. The pen scratched. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Clara finished the column, set down her pen, and only then did she let herself notice how tired she was. On her way home, Clara stopped, as she often did, at the newsstand on the corner to buy a paper, not for the news, but for the matrimonial column, which she read the way some women read serial novels. In 6 months of reading it, she had never once answered. She simply liked to read them, the way one looks into lit windows on a winter evening, wondering briefly about the lives going on behind them before walking on. That evening's column held 19 advertisements. A widower in Ohio wanted a woman of good character and sturdy constitution. A man in Kansas described his farm in numbing detail: 320 acres, 11 head of cattle, a good well, and said almost nothing about himself. Between an advertisement for liver pills and one for a lost setter dog named Duke, Clara found the 20th notice, added late, from Iowa, shorter than the rest. It read, "Farmer 34, Marion County, Iowa. Own land, sound house, fair crops. I can plant, build, and mend most anything a farm requires, except a sentence. If that does not trouble you, write to me. Signed, J. Reeves." Clara read it twice. Then she folded the paper under her arm and walked the rest of the way home in the cold without noticing it. And she found, when she reached her room, that she had been turning the sentence over in her mind the entire way, the way one turns over a coin in a pocket without meaning to. Except a sentence. She had never seen a man put his own failing in an advertisement meant to attract a wife. Every other notice in that column was a kind of varnish. This one had none. Clara had not always kept books for a living. Her father had run a dry goods business on Lake Street, and for most of her childhood, she had sat on a high stool beside his counter doing sums for fun, the way other girls did needlework. He used to say she had the head for it, and she did. When the business failed, quietly and completely, in the year after her mother died, it was Clara, then 22, who untangled what was left of it, column by column, until there was nothing left to untangle. Afterward, she had taken a position as a bookkeeper for a shipping firm on the river, one of only 2 women in the building, and she had done the work well enough that no one questioned it anymore. 6 years there had left her with her own small room in a boarding house, $110 in savings, and a life that ran by her own hand in straight columns. She was not unhappy, but she had noticed, in the last year or two, a particular kind of quiet that settled over her on Sunday afternoons. Not loneliness exactly, but the sound of a room built for one person, when one person was all that was in it. That night, Clara sat at the small table in her room and wrote a letter. She did not draft it twice. She told him her age, and that she kept books for a living, and that she had been doing sums since she was 7 years old, and had never once minded it. She told him that she had read a great many advertisements over the years, and that most of them described farms and almost none of them described men, and that his had done the opposite. She did not say anything about love or loneliness or what she hoped to find. She signed it Clara Whitfield, sealed it before she could reread it, and walked it to the post office the next morning before the office opened, while the street was still nearly empty. Joseph Reeves read Clara's letter at his kitchen table, by the light of the window, with his boots still on from the morning's work. He was 34. Broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that looked older than the rest of him. A cattle dog named Samson lay under the table with his chin on Joseph's boot, the way he did every evening, pretending, as he always pretended, that he was merely resting there and not waiting for anything in particular. Joseph had placed the advertisement himself in his own hand, which had cost him more than the fee, 3 drafts, crossed out and rewritten, before he let himself send the 4th. He had received 9 replies. Most of them described the writer in flattering terms that seemed copied from somewhere else. Fine complexions, sweet dispositions, devoted hearts, the same 3 or 4 phrases rearranged. He had read each one once and set it aside, the way a man sets aside a tool that is not the one he needs. Clara's letter, he read 3 times, which was his standard for anything he considered worth his time. It did not describe her at all, not really. It described a column of numbers and an empty Sunday afternoon, and 6 months of reading advertisements she had no intention of answering. It sounded, Joseph thought, like someone telling the truth without trying to. He sat with it a long while after the lamp had been lit, and then he refolded it carefully, and that night he wrote back. Over the following months, the letters went back and forth between Chicago and Marion County, slow, steady, and longer each time. Clara told him about a clerk at her office who had been caught padding his expense accounts, and how she had found it not by accusation but by a column that would not balance. Joseph told her about Samson, who had taken to sitting at the end of the lane every evening at the hour the mail carrier usually passed, regardless of whether there was any mail at all, and how the dog had begun to look almost personally offended on the days nothing came. Clara told him about a hard frost that had killed the geraniums on her windowsill, and how she had been more put out by it than she expected. Joseph told her about a fence line he had been meaning to mend for 2 years, and a neighbor's boy who had finally helped him do it. He wrote slowly, in plain block letters, and never apologized for it, which Clara noticed and respected. She wrote back the way she might write in a private journal, the kind of letters that left her feeling, afterwards slightly exposed, as though she had said more than she meant to. By the 4th month, they had exchanged 11 letters apiece, running 4 and 5 pages now. They knew by then a great many small things about each other. What made the other laugh, what the other worried over at 3 in the morning, how each of them took their coffee, without either of them having seen the other's face. There was no great obstacle. Clara's position could be given a month's notice, which she gave. Her landlady cried a little, which surprised Clara more than it should have. The shipping firm found another bookkeeper within the week, which did not surprise her at all. What gave her pause, in the end, was smaller and stranger. The morning she packed her ledgers, her own personal ones, the ones she kept for herself, recording nothing of any consequence to anyone but her. She sat for a long moment with one open on her lap, and thought that she was about to go and live among people who had never seen a column of figures in their life, and that this did not frighten her nearly as much as she had expected it to. She wrote to Joseph that she would come in the spring. His reply came back in 5 days, 4 words longer than necessary, which for him was nearly an embrace. The train left Chicago in the gray hour before full light, and Clara watched the city give way to the flat, dark farmland of Illinois. And then, after a night spent upright in her seat, to Iowa, wider, paler, the fields just beginning to green at the edges, she was afraid. She was afraid that the letters had made a better man of Joseph Reeves than the man himself, the way ink sometimes flattered a hand. She was afraid that the quiet she had felt on Sunday afternoons in Chicago was simply who she was, and that she had carried it onto this train with her. Somewhere past Iowa City, with the land opening into long gold-brown stretches under a sky that seemed to have no edge to it, Clara took his first letter from her bag and read it again, though she knew it by heart. Except a sentence, she thought. If that does not trouble you, write to me. It had not troubled her. She found, sitting there with the fields going by, that what she felt now was something closer to recognition, the way one recognizes a hand one has only ever seen in writing. She thought of Samson, sitting at the end of the lane each evening, waiting for a letter that might not come, and understood, all at once, that she had been doing the same thing in Chicago for longer than she liked to admit. The Marion County depot was little more than a platform and a water tower, and when Clara stepped down from the train, the first thing she noticed was not a face but a pair of hands, large, sun-marked, turning a hat slowly by the brim. "Miss Whitfield," Joseph said. "Mr. Reeves," she said. He took her trunk before she could protest, and for a moment neither of them said anything else. The light was doing something extraordinary to the platform, long and gold and low, the way it gets in the last hour before evening on the prairie, where there is nothing tall enough to interrupt it. "There's a dog," Joseph said finally. "Who's going to want to know your name before supper?" "Then I had better learn it first," Clara said, and something in Joseph's face, Something she would later think of as the first unlocking, eased very slightly. The house was smaller than she had pictured and better kept than she had expected. Swept floors, mended curtains. A kitchen that had clearly been the work of a man doing his best with instructions he'd half remembered from his mother. There were 2 chairs at the kitchen table where there might easily have been one, and Clara noticed this before she noticed almost anything else. Clara found within 2 days that the kitchen accounts, what was owed to the feed merchant, what the eggs and butter brought in at the store in town, existed mostly in Joseph's head, and not very comfortably there. He kept track of debts by means of small piles of stones on the windowsill, moved from one side to the other as accounts were settled, 11 stones in all. On the 3rd evening, without making any particular announcement of it, Clara took a blank book from her trunk, sat down at the kitchen table, and began to rule columns into it by lamplight. Joseph watched her from across the table for a while before he spoke. "I never was much good at letters," he said. "Numbers neither, not on paper. I can keep them well enough in my head, but they don't sit still for me on a page." "Numbers sit still for me," Clara said without looking up. "We can trade." She did not know it yet, but that single line, "we can trade," would turn out to be the truest sentence either of them had written or spoken in all the letters and all the years that followed. The ledger had room for figures. In time it would have room for a great deal more. Samson, under the table, shifted his weight onto Joseph's boot and sighed. The long-suffering sigh of a dog who has been waiting a great while for something and has just now decided it might be worth the wait. A week later, they sat together on the porch in the last light. The sky had gone the color of a ripe peach, and Samson lay across the top step with his chin on his paws. "I read your letters slow," Joseph said, after a while. "Slower than most would. I want you to know that wasn't carelessness." "I know," Clara said. "I could tell by the way you answered them. You answered things I hadn't asked outright. You wrote like you meant every word of it." "I did. I told you in the first one I wrote. I'd read your notice 3 months running before I answered it. The part about the sentence. I remember," Joseph said. 6 words. "I wrote that part myself, no help from anyone, and crossed it out 4 times before I let it stand." "I'm glad you let it stand," Clara said. Another pause. The light moved on the side of the barn, gold turning to copper, and somewhere off in the fields a meadowlark was making its evening argument with no one in particular. "I think," Joseph said carefully, "we might be all right, you and I." Clara looked out at the fields, where the wind was moving through the new wheat in long, slow waves, like something breathing. "I think so too," she said. It happened, in the end, 11 days later, while they were mending a section of fence. Clara holding the wire taut while Joseph drove the staples. Samson sits a few feet off with the particular air of a dog supervising work he had no intention of helping with. "I'd like to marry you, Clara," Joseph said, not looking up from the fence post. "If you're willing, I am," Clara said. She held the wire steady. "Hand me another staple." He laughed, a short, surprised sound, and handed her the staple, and that, more or less, was that. They were married the following Sunday, in the front room, with the minister come out from town and 2 neighbors as witnesses, a Mrs. Albright, who cried without any apparent embarrassment, and her husband, who held his hat the entire time as though he'd forgotten he was wearing it. Samson sat in the doorway throughout, refusing to come in or go out, as though uncertain which side of the threshold the occasion belonged to. Joseph wore his good coat. Clara wore the gray dress she had traveled in, brushed clean, with a sprig of early lilac pinned at the collar. The ring was plain. When it was done, Joseph called her Mrs. Reeves for the first time, a little carefully, as though trying the weight of it, and Clara found that she liked the sound of it rather more than she had expected to. The years that followed filled in the way a ledger fills, line by line, until the page is full. By the 2nd year, Clara's accounts had turned the farm's finances around so completely that Joseph began bringing her the neighbors' disputes over feed prices and shared wells, because everyone in the county had come to trust Mrs. Reeves's numbers over their own. By the 3rd year, in the evenings after supper, Clara had begun teaching Joseph his letters in earnest, not from a primer, but from the ledger itself, where the words were ones that mattered to him. Wheat, fence paid, owed, Clara. He was slow at it and patient with his own slowness, and some evenings he would sit for a long while over a single line, sounding it out under his breath, until it gave way to him. The ledger had room for figures, Clara thought, watching him. Now it had room for him too. Their first child was born in the spring of the 3rd year, a daughter, followed 2 years later by a son. The drought year of 1879 took half their corn but none of their cattle, and Clara's accounts, kept carefully through the lean months, were what let them keep the land when 3 of their neighbors lost theirs. By 1885, the house had 2 new rooms, a proper porch on 2 sides, and a kitchen garden that fed not only their own table but, most summers, the Albrights as well. The 2 chairs at the kitchen table had become 6 around it, and then, for a few years, 8, before the children grew and scattered into lives of their own. Samson grew old and slow, and spent his last years mostly asleep in the sun on the porch, though he still went, every evening until the end, to sit at the end of the lane at the hour the mail usually came, and Joseph took to walking down with him in his last winter, not because the dog needed the company, but because Joseph found that he did. The house was full. That was the word Clara found herself using, in her own mind more than any other. Full of voices, full of accounts that balanced, full of a kind of noise she had not known, in Chicago, that a house could hold. Joseph Reeves died in the winter of 1911, at the age of 71, at his kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold in front of him and the ledger open to a page of his own handwriting. Slow, careful. The letters a little uneven, the way they had always been, even after 37 years of practice. Clara was beside him. He went quietly, in the middle of a sentence he did not finish, and Clara sat with him a long while before she called for anyone, holding his hand, which did not feel any different than it had a moment before. In the weeks afterward, going through his desk, Clara found a small tin box she had never seen opened. Inside were her letters, all of them. Every one she had written him before she came west, returned to their original envelopes and kept in order, the paper soft from handling. At the bottom of the box was a single sheet in his own hand, undated. It was a draft of his advertisement, the one she had answered, crossed out and rewritten 4 times. Each version a little closer to the plain, short notice she had read that evening in Chicago, 37 years before. The final draft, the one he had sent, was there in full. Farmer 34, Marion County, Iowa. Own land, sound house, fair crops. I can plant, build, and mend most anything a farm requires, except a sentence. If that does not trouble you, write to me. And below it, in different ink, added much later, in the same slow and careful hand she had taught him to write. It did not trouble her, she wrote back. She stayed 37 years. I have built and mended a great many things since. I never did get better at sentences. I am told I did not need to. Clara held the page a long while. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the box, with the letters, where it belonged. Clara lived another 11 years on the farm, and she was not unhappy in them. The accounts still balanced. The wheat still came in most years. Her son took over the heavier work, and her daughter, married now and living in town, came out most Sundays with her own children, who liked to be told the story of the dog who used to wait at the end of the lane. The ledger itself still sat on the kitchen shelf where it had always sat. 2 kinds of handwriting in it, hers quick and even, his slow and careful, filling page after page until there was almost no difference between them. It had started with room only for figures. By the end, it had room for nearly everything. And some evenings, sitting on the porch as the light went, long and gold across the fields, Clara thought that Joseph Reeves had been exactly what his letter promised, and nothing more, except a sentence, and then, in the end, a great many of them, and that this had turned out, after everything, to be the most anyone could ask for.